This is the reality of politics today. We are in great danger in the West with these populists that are using, you know, these emotions and the cultural side of the political discussion to say we are in danger of migrants. And you know how come it's coming to you now? Immigration is going to be critical in your region. Now you can see it's coming very quickly and very sharp. All this discussion about who are you, where are you coming from, what do you want, all this business about who are you, the identity. And it's coming within Muslims, Buddhists, Chinese, Malay, and all this business, and some are playing with this. Do you know what I mean? You get that? It's you. I'm talking about you. So, just to make it clear, so if you don't deal with it, it's not going to be easy to come with democratic principles and to forget about this, because this is undermining all the political discussion. So let me set the scene here just to come to the principles we are talking about and not to come with a very theoretical discourse that has nothing to do with the reality of our life today. And not talking about the comprehensive approach, the economic side, the geostrategic side, and the cultural side. Now, having said that, and as an introduction to show it's complex, that I don't want only to please you with a theoretical discourse telling you at the end, you know, as Muslims, we don't have a problem with democracy. We may not have a problem with democracy, but democracy today has many problems. If you get what I mean by the whole introduction. So, with this, let us come to the first part of what I was saying. In fact, if you come to the political discourse and what the Muslims have been saying for years, it's true that before the 80s, the great majority of the Muslim scholars and the great majority of the people who were leading Islamist parties, the Muslim Brotherhood in Egypt and other, you know, Islamists around the world, it was true in Pakistan, it was true in Morocco, it was true in Algeria, very often they were saying, democracy is not the word we are going to use because democracy is coming from the West. We have one word which is a word that is rooted in the Islamic tradition. Democracy is not in the Quran. What we have is shura. Amruhum shura baynahum. They deliberate, they have consultation. This was the main word that we were talking about. And very often, for years, in fact, till the 80s, we had scholars who were fighting, can we use democracy? And the secular within the Muslim majority countries were using democracy, saying this is coming from the West, it is good. And the great majority of the Islamists were not using it, saying we have shura. It might be the same principles, but it's another name. And Sheikh Nahnah in Algeria, he wanted to make all the people happy. He said, okay, it's not democracy, shura is not going to be understood, let's us call it shuracracy. So just to make it something which is a bridge. And all the people were confused. The Muslims were not happy, and the Western people, the secular, were saying, you are playing with words. At the end, what is important, you know, terminology matters. By the way, you will see that the Democrats and how do you label people, it's depending from where you speak. And Foucault, in this, he was right. You know, to label and to give words and to decide the concept is a situation of power. The powerful are deciding the terminology and the definition. And you know this, for example, in Afghanistan, for years the people who were resisting the Russian presence were the resistance and they were good. And then when they started resisting the United States of America, they were the terrorists. So it depends who is deciding the words. And we know this. This is a reality everywhere. Now, if we come to, and this is a discussion that we had very, very early, in fact, in the 80s. And we have scholars. One of them was one of the first, by the way, Sheikh Yusuf al-Qardawi. He was talking from within the tradition of the Muslim Brotherhood, saying we don't have a problem with democracy. And the other one, who is now the ideologue of al-Nahda, Rashid Ghannouchi, was saying, coming from the Islamist trend, we don't have a problem with democracy. He was criticized by many within the Islamists, saying, no, it's wrong. But he was saying, we don't have a problem with democracy. know that there is something which is quite interesting. Muhammad Abdu, the end of the 19th century, just even before the whole discussion, was saying, he was the first to say this, he was facing the British colonization. And he said about the British colonization, we don't have a problem with the British system. We can take from the British their system, the parliamentary system, and make it Islamic. So there is nothing against the Islamic principles in the British parliamentary system, which was the first. And many people don't remember that Hassan Al-Banna said exactly the same. Hassan Al-Banna, the founder of the Muslim Brotherhood in the 40s, said we can use the British parliamentary system, meaning something which is implicitly is very important. Be careful when you speak about Islam not to confuse the principles and the models. The principles are universal and Islamic, but the models are historical, and you can take from the histories of others and other civilizations. When you speak about representing the people, the parliamentary system might not come from a Muslim mind, but it's not against the Muslim principles. If you get this, it's very important, because this is the starting point of our discussion in political terms. Are you talking about principles or are you talking about models? If you talk about principles, let us come to the principles first, and then we will talk about models. Because the Islamic principles for all the Muslims are universal. We want to stick to them. This is the way we are faithful to our principles. But the historical models, and some, for example, the Salafi literalists, the people who are very literalists, they don't care about history. They want to come back today with the model of the 7th century. And we told them that's just crazy. Even the Prophet, peace be upon him, never said that, never did that. He took the principles and he took from the people around him. He was adapting the models to the situation, even by being faithful to the principles. This is what we have to do today. So this was in the beginning of the 20s and the 30s that the first understanding of the Islamists was, let us stick to the principles and try to find the model. And then under the repression, because they were on the defensive, they say, no, the terminology is not being used. And for example, the first to have said this, Al-Mawdudi in Pakistan and Said Qutb, they were facing a minority situation. They were a minority facing a majority. And this is psychologically very important. In fact, they didn't want to use the terminology of the majority. And this is why, for example, Said Qutb was saying there is a terminology for Muslims and there is a terminology for non-Muslims. And for non-Muslim is al-Jahiliyyah, and for us is the Islamic reference. In fact, in principles, what he's saying is interesting. The way he was translating this was coming from a psychology of opposition. We are ourselves because the others are not like us. So we have our own terminology, which in fact at the beginning of the movement with Hassan Al-Banna was not at all the same. Hassan Al-Banna was not talking about this. He was saying the principles that we have, if we share them with others, we can take from others. He was not in this opposition mode. Why? Because he was not facing the repression that came after the 50s. The repression was really tough, and coming from Muslims, by the way, not coming from the British that were colonizing Egypt. I'm coming back to this history to make you understand that things have changed with history, because minds were moving and trying to understand where are we in the whole political discourse. And then with this, after all this history, starting with this, people came back to what was the situation at the beginning of the 20s and the 30s by saying, and this is now what we have, if you listen to what is coming from Turkey, that was quoted right now, from Tunisia, from Egypt, from the Muslims living in the world, we don't have a problem with the democratic principles. It doesn't mean that we are buying all the models as they are. And this is something in the book that I wrote in the beginning of the 90s, Islam, the West, and the Challengers of Modernity, I was saying, instead of talking and debating on words, by saying democracy is going from the Greek language, so it's not Islamic, and we go to the Quran to find the words, beyond the words, there are the principles. So let us try to get what are the principles that we have behind what is coming in the Islamic tradition when it comes to governance. That's the point. What are the main principles? And this is where you see, and you can get this very right, is that the principles are very often the same between what are the principles behind the democratic systems or the democratic models and what is promoted by Islam. Not exactly the same as to the consequences, because there is an ethic of principles and models and political systems that is very important in the Islamic tradition. But this means that the Muslims, wherever they are in Muslim majority country, they should respect the principles, even though they have the responsibility to find their own models. And their own models means the models should fit the reality of their country. So there is no political future in anything that is coming from Muslims if they don't rely not only on the Islamic principles, but on the history of the country, the psychology of the country, the culture of the country, and the citizens of the country, which is critical in any situation. Egypt is not Tunisia. Tunisia is not Malaysia. Malaysia is not Indonesia. Indonesia is not any country in Africa. Every country has its respective and specific history, memory, and collective psychology, and even diversity. And we have to deal with this as something which is critical in our understanding.